listeners. This is Encouraging Distraction. I'm your host, Jen. Today, as we cover Irish myths, legends, mysteries, and historical figures, we will be taking a trip to Augusta, Georgia, to cover the story of Charles Dawson Tilley and the last duel of Sandbar Ferry. It has been difficult sifting from the romanticized legends regarding the last duel of Sandbar Ferry. All that's left are references of references and half-remembered stories from a great uncle or a second cousin, which is the best part of any good Southern legend. Some accounts differ on a few aspects, such as dates, locations, names, and actions. Some retellings have grown into tall tales, and some details more gossip than fact. We may never be able to find all the facts about the life of Charles Dawson Tilley, or the truth of the most burning question of all. Was this duel fought out of love, or was it fought out of simple decency and respect? Very little is known about Mr. Tilley's early life and family. It is only remarked that he was born June 16, 1845, in County Carlow, Ireland. His parents had passed away when he was young. He had an uncle, who was a clergyman of the Church of Ireland, and a sister, but no names of the relatives were ever supplied in the news reports of the time. He emigrated to New York City when he was 24 years old to work as an accountant for Major Branch of the firm Branch, Scott and Company. He was relocated to Augusta, Georgia, exchanging skyscrapers and paved streets for farmhouses and muddy riverbeds. He was employed by Major Branch until 1873, where he then took up business for himself. Sometime after, he began lodging at Mary Clark DeLange's stunning buttercream yellow mansion on Green Street. Her husband, Louis DeLange, passed away at age 38, a death said from a wound he suffered during the American Civil War. Mary DeLange had converted the basement into apartments after her husband's death to keep an income for herself and her two surviving children, Martha and Louise. Gossip about Mr. Tilley and Mrs. DeLange swirled in the dust and heat not long after Mr. Tilley moved to the Green Street mansion. Mr. Tilley was a gentleman and well known to the citizens of Augusta as being intelligent and amiable. He was well educated and worldly, having attended university in Dublin and Paris. He was a handsome man with a strong brow, thick blonde hair, and light gray eyes. Mary Clark DeLange was known as a charming, warm woman whose home was the center of the Augusta social scene. Her facial features were smooth and sharp, with a small straight nose and a soft, narrow chin. In typical Southern fashion, people usually have the decency to keep a so-called known secret to themselves, and possibly a favorite neighbor or two. Unfortunately, George Radcliffe had no such decency and publicly accused them of having an affair, possibly out of his own jealousy. When Mr. Tilley heard of the accusations, he demanded to know the source of the gossip. Radcliffe declined, claiming it was common knowledge around Augusta and that everyone was well aware of their affair. Mr. Tilley demanded a duel for his honor, as Radcliffe's remarks were affecting his character as a gentleman. Their bitter resentment and correspondences were published in the local papers, commented upon like a local sporting event.
December 13th, 1875. Ratcliffe, rumours detrimental to my character coming to my ears as have been repeated by you, makes it obligatory upon me to demand of your authority. What these charges are, 'tis useless to me to mention, as I am confident you must be aware of their nature. I pronounce the charges as base, false, and malicious, and I will hold any man responsible for the farther repeating of the slander. Respectfully, Charles D. Tilley. December 14th, 1875. Tilley, Your note of yesterday's date by the hands of Captain W. Daniel was duly received. The rumours that you refer to came to my ears in the shape of a common report, and as such were repeated by me, so that the difficulty that would attend an effort of the kind compels me to decline to attempt to cite you a special authority. The last paragraph of your note is so general in its character and based so entirely upon contingencies that may arise in the future that I do not feel called upon to answer it. Respectfully, George E. Ratcliffe. December 14th, 1875. Sir, your note of this date through Captain Daniel adds insult to injury. I have to demand satisfaction for the wrong you have done me. This will be handed on by my friend Mr. Harris. Respectfully, Charles D. Tilley.
And their final correspondence was the declaration of their seconds. Mr. Tilley chose his business partner, J.W. Harris, and George Radcliffe chose W.H. Chew. The seconds, as per tradition, ensured that the duel was carried out under fair conditions on a proper field of honor at an appropriate time for both gentlemen, and that both were equally equipped with deadly weapons. It was decided that they would meet at Sandbar Ferry, a small shoal that sat in the middle of the Savannah River. It marked the state line of Georgia and South Carolina. The sandbar was popular with scorned gentlemen of Augusta. It acted as a no man's land, as dueling had been outlawed in Georgia. A coin toss on the day was to decide positions, and which of the seconds would make the call of fire to initiate the duel. As Radcliffe was the one who was challenged, he chose the weapons, Navy Colt pistols. Though it was decided that the duel would commence at 3 p.m., Mr. Tilley arrived at the shoal at 2 p.m. with Mr. Harris and 4 selected friends. With the extra hour, he took a moment to roll himself a cigarette while he waited for Radcliffe to arrive. The cool December wind whipped up the river and through the tendrils of tobacco smoke as Mr. Tilley and his men gathered together in a somber, businesslike demeanor. At 3 p.m., Mr. Radcliffe and Mr. Chew arrived with their 4 chosen accompanied men, all dressed in black clothing and high collars, as per the code. A silver coin was tossed into the air, and Mr. Harris was declared the winner. Mr. Harris chose east for their position, and Mr. Chew produced a long mahogany box from the carriage containing Mr. Radcliffe's weapon of choice, a pair of 6-inch Colt Navy pistols. Each man drew a pistol from the red velvet-lined box, taking the heavy wooden handles into their gloved palms. They took their positions 10 paces apart, backs turned. A cool and determined air hung between the 2 men. Mr. Harris took the honor of proclaiming fire, and the 2 men turned to face each other. The shots rang out, echoing across the water. Then Mr. Harris declared, "Stop!" and the reports of the pistols stopped to a deafening silence. The smoke cleared, and both men stood tall until slowly Mr. Tilley dropped his pistol and reached down to his abdomen to hold his wound. He sank into the soft white sands of the shoal, the blood shining a bright contrast against the soil. Mr. Harris rushed to his side to support him. Though now mortally wounded, he demanded a second round. Mr. Harris shook his head at the request. "Charles," he said, kneeling beside him, "I do not believe you would do yourself justice in your current position." Mr. Radcliffe stared down at the man, bleeding on his knees, for only a moment, and then he turned away. Mr. Chew turned to the 2 men and kneeled down into the blood and sand. He looked Mr. Tilley in his bright eyes and asked, "Mr. Tilley, are you now satisfied?" "Yes," Mr. Tilley said through his gritted teeth, "I am." and Mr. Chew took up the fallen pistol beside him. Mr. Radcliffe was placed into the carriage by Mr. Chew, who then went back to Mr. Tilly, his breath now sharp and sputtering from the wound. He reached his hand down to Mr. Tilly, and Mr. Tilly grasped it, both their hands now dripping and red. "I regret that blood was spilled on this day," said Mr. Chew, and with that he turned and went to take his seat next to Mr. Radcliffe in the carriage. Dr. Ford met Mr. Tilly and his gentleman on horseback as they made their way back to the mansion on Green Street. When asked if he regretted his actions, he replied, "I would do it again." The Weekly Sumpter summarized the event as the life of one's principles being offered up on the altar of offended honor. 2 days after Dr. Ford's surgery, infection set in. Though he survived the shot and the removal of the bullet, Charles Dawson Tilly wound blackened, and he passed away in a fever. With Charles Dawson Tilly's death, so too died Augusta's dueling tradition. The newspaper praised Tilly as a gentleman and mourned his loss. There was never another duel at Sandbar Ferry. The Augusta Constitutionalist published this epitaph upon his death. "The shades of death have clouded now the bright and gladsome eye. The grave now hides the stalwart form. He seemed so young to die. So young, so full of youth's proud strength, so brave and tender too. The bravest are the tenderest, their hearts most warm and true. The open heart, so quick to share, and others' wealth or woe. With gentle word and kindly smile, 'tis hard that such must go. But those who brighten here below, and mental sunshine shed o'er paths and others, struggling on, death early claims, 'tis said. Yet this it is makes heaven so clear, this life so little gain, that there we find the pure, the blessed, hope parting death, no pain. The gentle, loving, brave, and true dwell in that land above, where naught disturbs the perfect peace, and God himself is love."
Take my dollar, take my dime, take me right across that line. I feel your rumbling thunder, I keep it bedded down, but I can't keep it chained when you're around. I feel your rumbling thunder, I keep it bedded down, but I can't keep it chained when you're around.
You're saying that he got run out of town, basically, as well?
That's what they say. It's only noted in a following year that there's like a newspaper that talks about how George Radcliffe went out of business, and there's no records of his grave, and there's no records of anything past that. But he was a cotton broker. So the thing about that is that he would have been going out of business anyways, because
this is just after the Civil War.
It was, and cotton was going out of business. So like it wasn't as lucrative a trade as it once was.
Yeah.
So that would have also been a contributing factor. But a lot of historians like to attribute it to Mr. Tilly's death, because Mary DeLange was such an influential person in Augusta. Like after he died, she built this shrine to him in the Magnolia Cemetery, which is how I first came across this story. I've been dragged through multiple grave sites like Victorian era grave sites in my time, like antebellum era grave sites mostly. And in the center of Magnolia Gardens, there's this clearing, and they have like a marble gravel around it and a bench, and there's 2 flat stones on either side, and on your left is Mr. Tilly's grave, and on your right is Louise, her husband, and in the center is this massive Celtic cross, and it's just intricate, and it's kind of on this like raised, like it's got this marble border around it as well, and it's cared for. It's still like perfectly kept, and like in the center, it's very eye catching, and that's how I first found it. I found the grave. I'm like, this is something. Like this is like you read the gravestone that says like died defending the honor of it. I went home and I looked
it up.
Yeah, it was so sad. Like
Who says accountants are boring?
Very funny. Very funny. So I took these photos here. If it's going to load, it's not going to load. Oh, there it goes.
Oh yeah.
And it's just massive. And then later, Louise DeLange, daughter of Mary's daughter, built the Sexton Lodge, which is like the night watchman's lodge, and dedicated it to them. So on one side is the mother's portrait, and next to Mr. Tilly's portrait. So while there's no facts at all that they were ever in a relationship, it's the dedication to him after that's more telling than the duel itself and the correspondence that was published.
Interesting. Yeah, well, there's no smoke without fire, I suppose.
Yeah, but we'll never actually know. 3 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, they found the cornerstone of that Louise had put in there, and they found a bunch of letters, and they'd all hoped that they had found like the smoking gun, like like love letters between the two, but it turned out it was letters between Louise DeLange and his father in French about Mr. Tilly early life in County Carlow is very sparse. There's almost nothing. The only thing I could find about him and his family is that he left everything to a Kathleen Grove Ansley in Dublin and her husband, and that's it. That's everything. That's all the information that exists about them.
That's a pity.
I don't know if she's related to them. To him, I don't know who she is, or if it was like an aunt, or what the sister's name was, or what the uncle, or what his parents' names were, or where in Carlow. But like there's just no information. Just that he went to Dublin University, and that's it. Anyways. Well,
he was such a tragic end for someone who obviously meant a lot to a lot of people. Just kind of shows you how fragile life is, and it's it can really well, it really shows you, you know, just don't get into bar fights. Try and avoid them if you can.
Nothing happens, I'll see you soon. If nothing happens, I'll see you soon.
I just want to give a special thanks to Natalie Malone for researching the newspaper archives of Augusta for me. I realized I didn't have access to a good deal of material, and I needed a good librarian. So I'd like to take this moment and remind everyone to support your local public libraries. They are doing such a great service. I also want to give thanks to Mamie Lou Gardner for allowing us to use her music. And I want to thank Peter for reading today. And I wanted to thank you listeners for tuning in. Thank you for listening to Encouraging Distractions.
Too late. Burlington bristles the hair on my nape. Lawyer is waiting, got 2 whips to sell. Looks like a gold mine up on Gravel Hill. A match on the spider could buy us the moon, but if nothing happens, I'll see you soon. If nothing happens, I'll see you soon. If nothing happens,